When you see a piece of art like this, you know that whatever product it belongs to isn't going to screw around. It's dark, gritty, and chaotic, yet it still possesses fleeting moments of charm. It dares you to witness its acts of attempted filicide and dramatized bloodsport, whilst taking in its intricacies to achieve victory. Encompassing the spirit of love, hate, rage, revenge, fear, and many more emotions, this perfectly packages the human condition into a desolate wasteland of conflict. Shattering all expectations upon its release, it birthed a new direction for the series that had never been done before. Buckle up, because we're in for a long one. Yes, that intro was very dramatic and serious, but I made it that way because it perfectly replicates the tone of the game. Previous Tekken games were considerably less grounded and realistic than Tekken 4. Sure, they had a man throwing his son off a cliff, birthing a never-ending family rivalry, but this entry into the series feels very different. The perfect place for me to start is on the main menu. There are no videos containing the game's content, and hell, there's not even any music. Seriously, the only audio is the sound effect that plays when you hover over the next menu item. This game, like many other games that were released around the same time, has a very minimalist, almost bleak and desolate presentation and atmosphere to them. It's like you've been transported to a level of consciousness where all forms of life other than the characters on screen have been silenced, and it's oddly chilling. Let me demonstrate. Allow me to play the music that plays when you start story mode, but I'll play the audio over some Silent Hill 2 gameplay. Kind of fitting, isn't it? Those high-pitched screams with the track's growing intensity and loudness makes it feel like it'd belong in a horror game, yet it's meant to set the stage for a fighting tournament. The narrator sounds mechanical and lifeless, like you're interacting with a machine whose only purpose is to serve you. Take a listen to how he describes Kazuya's story.
20 years ago, Kazuya lost to Heihachi and was thrown into the mouth of a volcano. A few days later, he was brought back to life by G Corporation, a biotech firm making revolutionary advances in the field of biogenetics research. With G Corporation's aid, Kazuya investigated the biomechanics of the devil gene within him by subjecting himself to various experiments. Kazuya believed that once he unlocked and controlled the power of the devil gene, he would be powerful enough to defeat Heihachi and destroy the Mishima Zaibatsu. 20 years later, the Tekken forces attacked G Corporation's facility and stole their research data. Kazuya was also targeted in the attack. Kazuya was infuriated by Heihachi's interference once again. He was determined more than ever to exact his vengeance. Kazuya was not fooled by the sudden announcement of the King of Iron Fist Tournament 4. He knew that it was a trap orchestrated by Heihachi to lure him out. Despite this knowledge, Kazuya enters the tournament. This is his chance to defeat Heihachi.
The narrator's sterile pronunciation of his words and soulless vocal effects gives it an uncomfortable feeling that is unnerving to listen to. Even the character select screen, with its slow guitar and heavily altered vocals plagued with static, give this part of the game an almost dreamlike feeling, and it becomes white noise almost. Most of the game's soundtrack is low-key and laid back. The only loud track that comes to my mind at this point is the jungle music, and even that's a far cry from what you might expect if you're used to the high-energy electronic music featured in the Tekken 7 jungle stages. An example of low-key audio in Tekken 4 is the airport stage. As the evening sky takes over the world, aircraft surrounds the characters with this beautifully gentle and nostalgic music that plays as you traverse around the outer area of the airport. It's almost as if the music itself is taking you for a flight through the clouds, much like how the planes do in the back of the song. Or how about the building stage? As you explore the top of this gargantuan skyscraper, the grand piano instrumental contains a sense of elegance and intrigue, daring you to explore every nook and cranny of this stage to gaze at the cityscape that the level designers have created. If you haven't gathered by now, Tekken 4 uses audio, or sometimes a lack of audio, to great effect in the process of immersing you into its gritty and realistic world. While the audio plays a major role in immersion, so do the characters. More specifically, so do the characters' motivations and backstories. Right away, let's look at Steve, as his backstory is the perfect evidence for my current point. Let's watch Steve's character intro and see what we can learn about him.
Steve was a young British boxer enjoying his run as the middleweight champion of the world. Adopted during infancy, Steve sought the identity of his biological parents, as well as the origin of the scar on his arm. One day, Steve was ordered by a mafia group to throw a high-stakes fight, but he refused and instead won the fight. Unfortunately, the mafia made good on their threats and put a price on Steve's head. With the mafia in hot pursuit, Steve fled England for the United States and led a life underground. But Steve soon realized that no matter what he did, the mafia would eventually catch and kill him. He would never learn the truth of his past. Motivated by this realization, Steve
So, if you didn't know anything about Steve before, we now know that he is a professional boxer who is on the run from the Mafia, he never met his parents, and he has a mysterious scar on his arm that makes him search for answers. In just over a minute, we now know his backstory and primary motivation to fight. We also learn that Steve has a sense of honor and legitimacy by not throwing the fight. And what about Law? After declaring bankruptcy after his restaurant chain underperforms, he falls into depression and becomes an alcoholic, spending his days day drinking at home alone. That's a heartbreaking yet sadly realistic setup for a beloved character who has been a part of the Tekken series ever since the first release. In my opinion, Tekken 4 is the first game in the series to truly humanize its cast of characters and make them come across as living, breathing people, not just fictional characters. Each and every one of them has a legitimate reason to enter the King of Iron Fist Tournament 4. To King, maddened by the man who murdered his best friend and ensuring that he can fight him in the tournament. He even goes as far as to pay the bail for his killer's jail release so he can guarantee that they'll meet outside of prison. Christy, who is trying to find her good friend Eddie after he suddenly disappeared to avenge his father's death. Jin, who travels to Australia to completely unlearn his former fighting style, instead mastering karate so he can destroy his bloodline to prevent future conflict. To Julia, who is trying to find precious research data containing information that will help her protect her native land's ecosystem after it was stolen by the Mishima Zaibatsu, and the list goes on and on. By watching the character intros and endings, we start to care about them as if they're real. I wanted Steve to survive his nightmarish life, plagued by the fear of sudden death. I wanted Julia to retrieve that special data to ensure the safety of her native land. I wanted Jin to put an end to the Mishima bloodline once and for all, and I wanted King to avenge the memory of his former best friend and sparring partner. These characters are driven by anger, sadness, indifference to death, revenge, despair, and much, much more. While only one of them wins the tournament canonically, they all have their own unique outcomes that show how their lives would have changed had they won the tournament. To Law rebuilding his restaurant with a new, positive outlook on life, Julia successfully recovering the data that can help her save her homeland, Steve learning that he was conceived via IVF and that he never had a traditional family, King donating all the prize money to impoverished children around the world and not taking revenge on Marduk, who ended up being Armor King's killer, realizing that revenge is not the answer, and while definitely not the last character with an impactful ending, Christy, finally finding solace in her best friend after having spent so much time searching the globe for his whereabouts. All of these characters have relatable, thought-provoking resolutions to their individual stories, from love to hate and everything in between. Every character in Tekken 4 has something to gain, something to lose, and something to prove. When designing the game stages, the developers kept the grounded and realistic tone present. And while most fighting games, Tekken included, incorporate some fantastical elements into their stages, Tekken 4 keeps it entirely realistic and believable. The environments featured in this game are places that exist in real life. The jungle, with its uneven terrain, large trees, and flowing stream of water. The airport, with its flat tarmac surface with spectators watching the fight from the safety of the airport itself. The parking garage with its parked cars, steel pipes, and sturdy columns that can be destroyed. The shopping mall with its water fountains, storefronts, and escalators. The beach with its palm trees, shack, and ocean, which the characters can walk into. And not the last stage in this game, but I wanted to mention Shinjuku. Set in Tokyo, this stage is a recreation of Shinjuku, and it features many telephone booths and people watching the fight from multiple different storefronts. These places are grounded and realistic, and they go a long way in making you believe that this virtual world and its inhabitants are real, heightening that sense of player immersion you feel as you play the game. Another thing I wanted to mention is that these stages are huge. The jungle in particular is awesome, as the uneven terrain makes it feel like you're fighting in an area out of Metal Gear Solid 3. Other stages like the mall, beach, and airport are vast and almost beg you to explore and get lost inside of them. So much detail has been put into all of these locations, it's truly amazing. Exploring this shopping mall reminded me of Dead Rising, with its storefronts and architecture. You can fight here, here, and here, and the outcome of the fight can change depending on what gets in your way. Is your back to the wall in this part of the mall? Then try fighting over here, or here, or here. The point is, these levels are almost fighting game sandboxes, as they allow you to freely traverse through them to fight your opponent wherever you want to. Tekken 4 is the only game in the series to allow for uneven terrain in stages, as it brings some issues to combos and the overall balance of the game, and while that may be the case, I respect the Tekken team for trying something new with their series and putting lots of love and hard work into their drastically differing stage types. Even the stages that aren't that large and have regular terrain, like the secret lab and underground fighting circle, still have lots of personality. The lab's cold and metallic appearance, with the fog lingering around the bottom of the fighters, gives it a sense of mystique, whereas the fighting circle shows the game for what it is, people fighting for our entertainment. The way the crowd cheers and gets really loud as the fight progresses is authentic to an actual crowd around a real fight, and it goes a long way in demonstrating how astronomically different yet realistic all these stages can be. Another detail I wanted to mention about not only the stages, but about the game itself, is the visuals. Compared to previous games in this series, like Tekken 2, 3, and Tag Tournament, Tekken 4 improves the graphics substantially. This game came out at a time when graphics were advancing rapidly thanks to the new technology found in systems like the PS2, and while Tekken characters on the PS1 were blocky with polygons that you could see, Tekken 4's graphics were insane. Even today, decades after this game launched in arcades, I still find myself being impressed with the graphics. The game's brand new graphics engine improved the quality of lighting, introduced dynamic physics, and made surfaces smooth in comparison to the previous games, adding credibility to the realistic tone. Even Tekken Force, which was presented from a side-on view in Tekken 3 with static images for backgrounds, is now an over-the-shoulder, fully 3D beat-em-up mode. I also want to highlight the graphical fidelity of the game. I consider graphical fidelity to be a combination of detail, resolution, and frame rate, so let's break down those 3 points individually. As mentioned before in the previous part, the stages have incredible detail, so let's talk about detail found in the character models. Take a look at Kazuya and note his skin. The imperfections, lighting on his cheek, facial scar, and red heterochromia all look more realistic than ever when compared to the previous games. And what about Jin, with his hoodie covering his face, adding to his unsocial personality? Notice how the drawstrings on his hoodie and fabric of his pants react to his body's movements, highlighting the detailed clothing physics the developers incorporated into the game. Moving on to the resolution. This point might sound simple, just point out that the PS2 had a 480p/480i output and move on, right? Well, I want to compare Tekken 4 to previous games in this series once again. While Tekken 3's arcade machine had a standard CRT monitor with a 336x240 resolution, Tekken 4 uses a 512x384 resolution with yet another CR monitor, although this monitor has less video delay, allowing for a more responsive experience. Tekken 4 also runs on the Namco System 246 hardware, which was based on the hardware found inside the PS2, which means the game received an arcade-perfect port onto that system. Launching on the PS2 a year after hitting the arcades, Tekken 4's home console port is, in terms of graphics, extremely similar to the arcade version, to the point where I didn't notice any major differences, but one thing I thought was interesting is that on the arcade beach there are no NPCs in the background, just the fighters, but there are NPCs on the PS2 version. Finally, let's move on to the frame rate. Both versions of the game run at a solid 60 frames a second. Between emulating the game and playing it on original PS2 hardware, I didn't notice any frame rate issues. Combine the solid frame rate with highly detailed graphics and state-of-the-art physics and reflection simulations, and we get a ridiculously impressive graphical showcase being presented as a fighting game. This next part is a sort of continuation of the previous part as it concerns how things look. More specifically, how things look in motion. I'd like to look at Steve again as he is great for explaining things. Without seeing him throw a single strike, you know that Steve is a pro boxer from his stance and gloves. With his left foot forward, we can tell that Steve is an orthodox boxer, and with his slightly bent knees, raised fists, and back and forth swaying, we also know that he's ready for action. Another example would be Law. Law's stance is reminiscent of Bruce Lee, which tells us that he is using a Jeet Kune Do fighting style. The footwork and constant movement let us know that he is ready to spring into action at any moment, true to real-life demonstrations of the martial art. But enough about idle animations, let's get to the actual fighting techniques. Going back to Steve, look how quickly he throws punches towards the enemy whilst moving forward and sometimes changing his stance before returning to his original positioning. These attacks look and feel real as the animators for the game must have studied boxing, Jeet Kune Do and other martial arts to perfectly replicate them in the game. Sure, some moves like Steve's punch to the legs might be exaggerated because it's a game, but the core idea of representing real-world fighting techniques is pulled off beautifully well in Tekken 4. Another perfect example of this representation is with Hwoarang. As a Taekwondo practitioner, he effortlessly switches between stances whilst throwing out deadly kicks along the way. As Taekwondo isn't heavily based on punching or open palm strikes, most of Hwoarang's moves consist of kick attacks. Hell, you can even input a command to make him change stance at will, which real Taekwondo experts do all the time. More specifically, look at Hwoarang's right jab to right flamingo combination. He starts off with an open stance, throws out a jab, fakes a kick by lifting his leg up, and then uses that kick to change his stance, switching the vulnerable parts of his body to throw his opponent off. Little things like this are present throughout not only Tekken 4, but the entire series. However, I wanted to mention this with Tekken 4 specifically, due to this game bringing the series properly into the next generation of consoles, as it never released on PS1 hardware, which is what Tekken Tag Tournament's arcade board was based on. We've only covered 3 out of the 23 characters in this game, and they all represent a variety of styles, from karate, vale-tudo, bajichuan, pro wrestling, and kickboxing, just to name a few. I made this video to appreciate Tekken 4 in the modern day. While we're spoiled now with the constant stream of updates, DLC, and developer interviews, back in 2001, there pretty much wasn't any of that. Hell, I wasn't even alive back then, so all the info in this video was from research I conducted, not from memory. Tekken 4 has lots of critics who hate the uneven terrain in stages, fan favorite characters being missing, and a lot more. But one thing everyone agrees on to be excellent is the realistic and grounded tone. Overall, if I did my job right, you'll leave this video having learnt why the game's tone is fantastic, and how the game uses visuals, audio, and narrative to achieve said gritty tone and bring it to the forefront of the screen. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.